Osowiec fortress had stood for too long, and now it had fallen. The toxic clouds that had been released upon it in the weak hours of the morning had spread over the bridge now taken by the Landwehr 18th. The great cannons in the rear line continued to rain hellfire on the Slovacs in the distance. Otto couldn't help but walk with a sense of pride to all this, as intelligence claimed that the defenders of the fortress numbered no more than 1,700, and for a month they had proved a stalwart opponent. But a crucial weakness had made itself apparent. The defenders of Osowiec had not been prepared for a gas attack. Intelligence stated that not a single gas mask was spotted among the fortress's holders, and such an obvious weakness would thus seal their doom. Otto remembered seeing the balloons filled with the toxic gases as they floated eastward only a few hours before, and the rain of caustic clouds that burst from them. Now, where Osowiec had been a symbol of Russian resolve for much of the Great War, it now served as the tomb of the Tsar's dogs. Otto couldn't help but think of the previous times the Russians had stemmed the eastern advance. He had heard the rumors, even seen glimpses of the reports, but he could hardly believe such absurdities. Twice before now, Osowiec had broken his country's attempts to take the fortress. Both times, its defenders were outnumbered, and yet they dug themselves deeper and deeper, until a retreat was the only way to save German lives. Otto chuckled to himself as he marched ahead with his squad mates on the bridge towards the fortress, his laughter muffled by his mask. The genius of Commandant von Hindenburg, the field marshal tasked with taking Osowiec, ensured that there wouldn't be any defenders this time around. The gas had seen to that. The low morning sun had been covered by the chemical clouds, and when Otto turned back to where they had come, the cannon fire popped through the smog like embers and smoke, and seconds later he could hear the crash and boom of the missiles flying through the sky, raining down on Osowiec like a god's own wrath. Perhaps that was why he found this whole situation so enjoyable. The sheer destruction capable of being wrought by the Kaiser's finest in the face of his foes seemed nearly divine in origin. The German army could walk with impunity with missiles such as these, and, as Otto saw it, could win the war by next year if things went as successful as they did today. Walking along the bridge to Osowiec, Otto's squad leader, Friedrich, held his hand high in order to cease in movement. Like clockwork, the squad behind him stopped and readied their Grahir rifles. Friedrich gave another silent order to find cover and ready their weapons, which were eagerly performed by his men as they dove behind the detritus that littered the bridge, waiting for whatever it was that Friedrich had seen or heard. Otto, having taken cover behind a crate blown open during the fighting, raised his rifle and pointed it in the fog that shrouded the opposite side of the bridge, towards Osowiec. He held his breath and steadied his aim, though he wasn't sure what for. The defenders of the fort were dead, so what had caused Friedrich to pause his march? Otto sat and waited for a few more moments before he realized. The silence. A grim, eerie silence from all around them. The cannons behind them. They had stopped firing. He breathed a small amount, knowing the shelling would end regardless of anything, though Otto took a strange comfort in the distant sounds of his countrymen's artillery. He looked back to Friedrich, who motioned for everyone to advance. They had not even crossed the first defense line yet. Moving much more slowly than before, the thumping of Otto's boots on the wooden bridge were, at first, a comfort to his ears, having replaced the thumping of the guns far away. But, as he and the others neared the other side, he soon began to wonder if the silence would break, or whether or not the wrath of God had killed not only the fortress's defenders, but even the courage of Osowiec's new owners. A few more seconds passed, and then he heard it. Gunshots to the south, near Sosna, a small town and said to have been depopulated before the gassing. The Landwehr 76th were ordered to take Sosna for security over the region, but what resistance could they have met down there? The town was empty, drained of life, and yet fighting seemed to continue. Then the gunshots turned to the far-off sounds of artillery fire, and Otto could see again, even through the fog and haze of the toxic clouds, the town of Sosna was being torn apart by shells. Turning back to the bridge before him, Otto was nearly to the other side, where half a dozen of his comrades had secured a foothold, when gunfire broke out again, much closer this time. Otto watched as the shoulder of Werner, one of his squad mates, exploded in red gore and bone shrapnel, showering the men beside him and dropping him to his back. As the toxic air came into contact with his raw flesh, Otto could swear he saw it fizzle and burn, and Werner began to writhe in pain from more than just his fresh wound. As Werner twisted on the ground, the soldiers beside him took to defensive positions as more and more gunfire sailed through the dense fog around them. "Raus! Raus!" cried Friedrich, as he pointed his Luger into the clouds and fired, popping rounds into the smoke at unseen enemies. Otto touched the ground and watched as Friedrich was then torn apart by gunfire, puffs of bloody mist blasting from his body. Frozen in fear, Otto crawled his way back to behind the crate he had hid behind before, as his fellow squad mates continued to fire into the fog. He tucked his back against the box, and just as he ready to fire back, he froze in fear at the sound of what was coming. A blood-curdling chorus of voices, hundreds of them it seemed, came from the fog beyond, choked and rasped, so unnatural, so alien in its sound. The return fire of the Landwehr 18th ceased in its entirety. Then he saw them, charging from the fog in droves like the demons of hell, came the walking dead. Otto watched as men, clad in the blood-drenched uniforms of Osowiec's defenders, the flesh of their hands burned and melted away to reveal tendons and bone, as many of their faces were covered in rags dripping with their own lifeblood, emerged from the fog, bayonets raised. The first line of the German advance quickly fell, as the bayonets of the dead men plunged themselves deep into their bellies and twisted, spilling out intestines and organs. Men cried and convulsed in fear and pain as the dead men rushed past them and into the soldiers behind. Otto, himself paralyzed with fear, watched as the once brave Austrian men of the Kaiser's army, those thankfully far enough away from these corpsemen, had turned and retreated back towards the artillery line. Otto watched as they ran, leaving him behind on the bridge, surrounded by these blasphemous creatures. Watching as his countrymen continued to retreat, the stampede and gunfire of the dead men slowly going with them, silence returned to the bridge of Osowiec. Otto was alone, clutching his rifle in his hands while the lenses of his mask had fogged slightly. Trembling, he then heard once again the sounds of boots walking on the bridge. Turning his head so slightly to the right, Otto saw one of these monsters with his own eyes. Its face was uncovered, and what Otto saw had horrified him. Dripping from the creature's mouth was the black stain of blood and mucus. Its skin was pallid and gaunt, but its eyes remained opened and raw, tortured against the poisoned sky that surrounded it. Clutching in its hands was one of the pistols of the Russian army, and though its uniform was probably once pristine, it had now been coated in smeared viscera. Otto saw the abomination raise a fist to its chest and cough. A labored, guttural affair that sounded as if its lungs were ripped apart from the inside. Indeed, Otto saw in its gruesome glory as the creature hacked up small bits of flesh that fell to the bridge's planks in wet splats. Shrinking as far as he could away from the monster before him, Otto trembled at the sight of it. Ragged breaths, riddled with phlegm and gore, followed its coughing fit, and it turned its head, scanning the horizon from right to left. Otto followed its gaze and saw for himself the total rout of Germany's finest in the face of this horde of unnatural beasts. He had noticed that machine gun fire had taken up somewhere from the south, from Osowiec itself. The firefight from the routing lines intensified. Another coughing fit came from the thing beside Otto, which took its attention away from the fighting to the east, as the dead man coughed more and more into its hands. Its red eyes, blaring and raw, flicked its vision to the left. It saw him. Otto yelped and fired his rifle clumsily, missing the creature by inches. As he did, it too jumped back and raised its pistol, firing round after round into Otto's body. Pain erupted from his torso, left leg, and arms as the bullets ripped into his flesh, piercing his organs and splintering his bones. Adrenaline allowed Otto to fire his rifle again, but the shot missed. Coughing up his own blood inside his gas mask, Otto's vision began to blur as he watched the dead man toss aside his weapon. He lunged at Otto and bared its yellow, gore-stained teeth. Helplessly, the soldier tried to wrestle with the creature, trying to keep it away from his combat knife. But as his strength drained from his body, Otto failed, and his blade was taken from him, then sunk into his body over and over again. Through the lenses of his gas mask, which filled quickly with his own blood and spit, Otto watched as the monster before him pulled the knife away and lumbered back east, towards the firefight machine guns, towards this attack of the dead men.